It's horrifying how quickly an ordinary day can turn into a nightmare, from picking out a shirt to putting a gun to your chest in less than an hour, and how two people whose only crime was growing old being black were apprehended with great humiliation, two arrogant cops who had already forgotten what respect looks like. That morning was ordinary, not perfect, but a quiet that only elderly couples understand, where silence needs no filling and every look says more than words ever could. Harold spread out on the table his pressed dark blue shirt that he wore on special occasions, and Evelyn wrapped a small box in pale pink paper with hands that still trembled slightly with age but moved with purpose. It was their granddaughter's birthday, and very first dance recital, and she begged them to attend. "You have to sit in the front row, Grandpa," she said, "I want to see you when I spin." So they left early, or at least they thought they did, but the traffic had other plans, and as they sat in the car watching the clock tick forward as if mocking them, Harold pressed the gas a little harder, hoping to gain time on the open road ahead. Evelyn was reading the program again, checking to make sure they had everything, flowers, a gift, a card, and teasing Harold about forgetting his glasses, when suddenly red and blue lights flashed behind them, streaking across the rearview mirror like sirens in a nightmare. Harold sighed, but not with guilt, but with disbelief. He drove at top speed. The car was in perfect condition. He hadn't broken a single law. And yet he pulled over slowly and carefully to the side of the road, just as he'd been taught decades ago during his first conversation about how to survive a police stop as a black man, a conversation he never thought he'd still need at 75. A police cruiser parked behind them, and two officers got out of it. One was young, wiry, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses too big for his narrow face. The other was broader, older, his expression already sour, as if they had interrupted his lunch. Neither of them smiled. Not one gave a greeting. Harold rolled down his window and kept both hands on the steering wheel. Evelyn clutched her purse and pressed her lips together, sensing something was wrong, not because of what had been said, but because of the silence that followed. "License and registration," the junior officer snapped at her. Harold nodded, speaking slowly and evenly. "They're in the glove compartment. My wife will get them now." The older policeman stepped closer, putting his hand on his waistband. "No sudden movements," he muttered, as if it were a threat clothed in the form of a warning. Evelyn pulled out the papers and handed them to him. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from something colder, something that had been buried for decades and was now breaking through to the surface again. "We're going to our granddaughter's birthday party," she said, trying to put cheerfulness in her voice, trying to bring humanity to a situation that was already becoming too grim. "We might be a little late." "Everything okay, officer?" The younger man didn't answer. He stared at the license, then at Harold. "You look nervous." "Why?" Harold met his gaze. "Because I got pulled over for no reason when I was trying to get into a kid's party. That usually makes people nervous." The officer smirked. "Is there anything in the car we should know about? Weapons? Substances?" "No, sir," Harold replied, remaining calm. "Just flowers and a wrapped gift for a 6-year-old. There was silence, not the usual silence, but the kind of silence that hums with unspoken intentions, the kind that feels like something is about to go wrong. The older officer walked slowly around the car, peering at the tires, peering into the back seat, lips pursed. Evelyn glanced at Harold and whispered, "We don't have time for this. We're already late." At that moment the mood changed completely. The younger policeman leaned in again, this time closer to Harold's window, and his breathing became audible in the cool air. "Get out of the car," he said stiffly. Harold blinked. "Excuse me." "Get out." "Out. Out. Out of the car." No explanation. No warning. Just orders, her hand ever closer to the holster and her eyes daring not to resist. Evelyn's voice cracked. "Officer, please, this is some kind of mistake. We're just on our way to see our granddaughter. I said get out." Harold looked at his hands, still resting on the steering wheel, still calm. But something inside broke not his spirit, but his illusion that he somehow, after everything, deserved peace in this country. As he slowly opened the door, the officers took a step back, their postures stiff and their facial expressions unreadable. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know yet. But they were about to find out at once. Harold got out of the car slowly, every movement was deliberate, he knew how to behave in such situations and what might follow if you were black. The wrong look, the wrong breath could be taken as a threat to a white policeman if your skin didn't match the badge, and though his knees ached, and his back protested, he stood to his full height, and looked them both in the eye with that tired dignity that only men who have seen war, who have buried brothers overseas, who have come home to be called hero by the same country they fought for, can carry without breaking. Evelyn followed him, hooking her fingers into the edge of the door as if it were the only anchor in a sea of absurdity, and stood silently beside her husband, her heart pounding, not because she was afraid for herself, but because she knew what it meant to be black, elderly, and accused in a place where truth meant nothing unless force was behind it. The older officer invited them to come to the front of the car. Hands on the hood. Harold hesitated. "Officer, what's the charge?" "You're acting suspiciously," the younger one said, already circling the car. "And your tone is very aggressive, toward law enforcement." Evelyn's mouth opened slightly in protest, but Harold touched her lightly on the elbow, not to silence her, but to remind her that some battles can't be won on the sidelines, especially when the people doing the fighting carry guns and smirks rather than common sense. The search began without warning, the trunk swung open, exposing their personal belongings, the bouquet of flowers was tossed aside like trash, the carefully wrapped gift ripped to shreds when the older policeman began rummaging through it with gloved fingers, as if a music box wrapped for a little girl could somehow conceal contraband. Their suitcase, stuffed with spare clothes in case they stayed the night, was open and overturned, underwear and medicine bottles scattered across the pavement like evidence at a non-existent crime scene. "Sir, you have no right to," Evelyn began, her voice rising despite her fear. The junior policeman turned to her with a cheeky smirk. "Ma'am, I suggest you watch your tone before you give us cause for further proceedings." "And what would that reason be?" she asked in a barely audible whisper. He didn't answer. He simply stepped close to her, so close that she could see his pupils, and said, "You don't like the way we do things? Who are you going to complain to, huh? To the bingo committee? To the manager of the nursing home?" At that moment Harold's voice changed. Not louder, not angrier, but heavier, like a man trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. "Young man," he said in an even but low voice, "you have no idea who you're talking to." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Are you someone important?" Harold looked at him without averting his eyes. "I've worn the uniform since before you were born. I've spilled blood in places you can't find on a map. I stood when this country asked me to, even when it didn't stand for me." The officer smirked. "That's a cool story. Do you have a sticker or something to prove it?" And then, as if the scene wasn't absurd enough already, the senior officer cut in, "We're detaining you both for further questioning. Your behavior is erratic, your tone is disrespectful, and the whole thing is just kind of off." Evelyn sighed. "You can't just." But they were already moving, reaching for the handcuffs, not because there was danger, not because there was evidence, but because power makes little men feel tall when they use it recklessly. Harold didn't resist, but the resentment wanted to come out. Evelyn cried. They were too tired for outrage, too sensible for panic. They watched as their belongings were left on the side of the road, as they were stacked in the back of a police cruiser as suspects, as strangers, as people whose story didn't matter. As the door slammed behind them and the engine roared to life, the junior officer looked back over the cage and grinned. "Today we're going to teach you to respect the badge," he said without a shadow of shame. "I bet you didn't act like this in Africa, did you?" Evelyn closed her eyes. Not because she was afraid, but because she needed a moment, to catch her breath, to gather her thoughts, to remind herself that their granddaughter was still waiting, that their daughter would be wondering if someone would notice. And in that moment, as they sat silently in the back seat of a car that should have been reserved for criminals, not grandparents, something had already started to move, because the phone kept ringing on the other side of town, unanswered, and someone must have realized that Harold and Evelyn were missing. The drive to the station seemed longer than it actually was, but not because of the distance, but because of the silence that stood between Harold and Evelyn, like a third presence, dense and heavy, pressing on his chest as they stared ahead, hands still cuffed. Harold thought of his granddaughter's voice, about how she had said, "Don't be late, Grandpa," and about how he had promised he wouldn't miss this event for anything, not realizing that the obstacle would be not traffic or time, but the two officers who looked at him and saw everything but the man he really was. When the car finally stopped, the back doors opened with a rough jerk, and the officers yanked them open not forcibly, but with careless force, the way one does to someone they don't respect, and as they entered the station, each fluorescent bulb humming louder than the last, casting a harsh, sterile glow on the cheap linoleum floor that had probably seen more injustice than justice. No one asked questions. No one raised an eyebrow. The desk clerk looked up, saw an elderly black couple in handcuffs, and went back to writing in the logbook as if it were a common occurrence in their precinct. No Miranda rights. No formal charges. Just a half-whispered suspicion of disorderly conduct scribbled on a clipboard by a man who wouldn't even look them in the eye. Their personal belongings were taken from them, their phones put in plastic bags, Evelyn's purse was tossed in the trash like it was nothing, and all the while Harold remained silent, jaw clenched, staring at the floor, because if he stared at the officers for long enough he might say something he couldn't take back. They were led down a narrow hallway that smelled of sweat and bleach and regret, and then into a cell. Metal bars. A cold bench. Two other men were already sitting inside, young, tired, with eyes scanning the newcomers with the quiet resignation of people used to seeing the system play by its own rules. Evelyn sat next to Harold, so close that their shoulders touched. She wasn't crying anymore. They didn't want to give these people the satisfaction of making them suffer. But it was Evelyn who first broke the silence, her voice no louder than a breath. "Do you think they're already looking for us?" Harold nodded slowly. "They're bound to find us. They'll wonder where we are. They'll find us." And across town, someone was already looking. Their daughter, Miriam, called them twice, then 3 times, and with each unanswered call, her anxiety grew from mild irritation to full-blown panic. She knew her father never ignored calls, not from her, not ever. She tried calling Evelyn. Straight to voicemail. Then she called the school where the concert was being held. The performance had started, her daughter was already on stage. The parents were still nowhere to be seen. Her husband, Marcus, watched her walk around the living room, holding the phone to her ear like it was a lifeline that kept breaking off. Then she stopped. "I'm going that way," she said. "To their house. Maybe they're still home." Marcus grabbed his keys. "I'm coming with you." It took them 10 minutes to reach the quiet street where Harold and Evelyn had lived for the past 30 years. Their car wasn't in the driveway. Marcus frowned. "That's odd. They always park in the same spot." Miriam knocked. There was no answer. They checked the windows. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as they turned to leave, a voice from across the street called out to them. Mr. Jenkins, their longtime neighbor, was standing on the porch, frowning. "Are you looking for your folks?" he asked. Miriam nodded. "Have you seen them?" He pointed toward the main road. "They left about an hour ago. But I saw something very strange, how a police squad pulled them over a few blocks from here. I thought it was just a ticket or something, but..." He paused. "But what?" "They put them in the back seat. And drove off. Left the car there. I went downstairs afterward, their car is still there. The doors are open. Stuff scattered on the ground." Marcus remained silent. He was already pulling out his cell phone. And then the second part of the story began, the one the officers never waited to hear. Because they didn't know, couldn't imagine, that Marcus wasn't just a concerned son-in-law. He worked for the Department of Homeland Security. And when someone like Marcus starts asking where a decorated veteran and his wife have disappeared, a man with clearance, with authority, who can move an entire department with a single phone call, people start listening. Quickly. Get in the car, he said to Miriam. I'm making the call. Now. It had started with a single call, not panicked, not loud, just precise and professional, the kind of voice you only hear when someone on the other end has power and knows how to use it. Marcus didn't need to yell or threaten, because the weight of his badge and access to the database behind his name did all the yelling for him. He made 2 calls. One to his supervisor. One to the regional command. He gave times, names, last known location, vehicle description, and 15 minutes later the quiet suburban police station that usually spent Saturdays logging drunken teens and compiling traffic accident reports was in the center of a storm it wasn't prepared for. In his cell, Harold sat motionless, arms crossed, frozen against the cold bench, eyes closed not from fatigue but from something deeper, an unwillingness to let this place define him, to rewrite the dignity he'd earned all his life. Evelyn stopped asking what time it was, stopped hoping for an explanation. The young man sitting across from them offered them a half-empty bottle of water. Neither of them accepted. They didn't need comfort. No one came to see them, no one checked in on them, no one even acknowledged that they were here. And then the door opened. Not the cell door. The front door. 2 black SUVs pulled up quickly and silently, no sirens or screeching tires. 4 agents walked in, not in uniform but with badges that spoke for themselves, Homeland Security, Federal Oversight Division. They walked clearly, scanning the room with their eyes, as if they already knew what they were looking for. The duty officer stood up, confused, trying to hide his surprise with an imperious tone. What can I do for you gentlemen? The lead agent didn't smile. He didn't blink an eye. We're here for Harold and Evelyn Richardson. Where are they? The officer blinked. Who? At that moment, everything turned upside down. At that moment everything began to unravel. Because upstairs, in the small room where officers typed slow reports and gossip between calls, 2 names had become a problem that no one knew how to explain. The chief was already on the phone when a lieutenant walked in, holding a printed scan of Harold's military record, his commendation, his picture in uniform, younger, prouder, holding a flag next to the men who never came home. And next to that folder, a photo of Marcus himself, with a full federal ID. Why didn't anyone give their names? The lieutenant barked. They weren't arrested, someone stammered. They were just interrogated. For what? For being grandparents in a sedan? Jesus! Downstairs, the agents waited no longer. They walked past the desk, demanding access, and when the desk clerk hesitated, one of them leaned over and said quietly, "Would you like to be on the news tonight?" There was the sound of polished shoes and the slamming of clipboards in the hallway. The arresting officers, the younger one with mirrored glasses and the older one with a smirk, were now standing in the back of the precinct, whispering to each other, pale, stuttering, the arrogance that had carried them all day now quickly sucked out like air from a flat tire. They didn't say they were tied up, the younger one muttered. They didn't have to, said the captain behind them, arms crossed, stone-faced. You were supposed to treat them as people, not suspects. But it was too late. The agents had reached the cell. And when Harold looked up and saw the door open, he didn't stand up. He waited. Waited for someone to speak first. Mr. Richardson, the agent said, his voice softer than expected, his gaze steady, respectful. We're here to take you home, sir. Evelyn blinked. Home. Harold nodded, stood up slowly, looked at the 2 young men still sitting beside him in the cell, and stepped forward. The handcuffs had been removed. No apologies, yet. Just calm hands moving with urgency. And as they stepped out into the hallway, past 2 officers who couldn't meet their eyes, Evelyn stopped and turned. You said we didn't matter, she said, her voice calm but deadly. "You laughed. You still think that's funny?" The junior officer swallowed hard. And said nothing. The hallway was quiet again. But outside by the SUV, Miriam stood crying, her daughter in a little blue dress sitting beside her, clutching a pink-wrapped gift the agents had found on the side of the road. Harold saw her and paused. Then he smiled. The smile wasn't very wide, just enough to say, "We're fine." But this wasn't over. Someone had to answer for this. By the next morning, it was no longer just a family affair, it was a national scandal. No sooner had the sun risen over the quiet suburban streets where Harold and Evelyn had been humiliated than the internet was filled with headlines written in bold black letters: "Police detained elderly black veteran and his wife for no reason, subjected to racial slurs and illegal search." Harold's military service photos were placed next to images of the precinct, the camera, the gift box left crumpled on the curb, and the public didn't need context, they saw everything in those images. They saw a man who gave his country everything while sitting behind bars as a criminal. They saw a woman, proud and dignified, who was silenced by two men with badges and egos. And they saw themselves, their fathers, mothers, grandparents, and something inside them broke. The news learned of the story by noon. By 3 p.m., reporters were standing outside the station, shouting questions into microphones, while stunned officers tried to pretend nothing unusual had happened. But now nothing could stop the flow of information, first local channels, then regional, then national. A clip of Evelyn saying, "You said we didn't matter. Do you still think that's funny?" was repeated on every channel, over and over, until it became a call to action. By late afternoon, the city's mayor, a man who had spent most of his term shaking hands and dodging responsibility, stood before the cameras, cleared his throat and read a prepared statement with shaking hands. "On behalf of the city, I offer a full and unreserved apology to Mr. Harold Richardson and his wife, Mrs. Evelyn Richardson. What happened is unacceptable. It does not reflect our values, and it will not go unpunished." He didn't answer any questions. He didn't need to. Because behind his back, city officials were already doing the paperwork. The two officers who initiated the stop immediately placed on unpaid leave. By midnight, after reviewing surveillance footage that showed clear violations of protocol, an unreasonable search and seizure, and a disgusting comment recorded on the video, both officers were fired from their positions, effective immediately. Meanwhile, at the Veterans Hospital across town, Harold sat in a clean white room, sunlight pouring in through the window and a blanket thrown over his lap. He wasn't sick. He wasn't injured. But the hospital director had offered to arrange something special, something that would make a difference. Because Miriam had a request. She asked that the concert her daughter danced at while her grandparents sat in a jail cell be shown again, just one more time, not on a stage, but right here in the hospital, in front of the man who missed it. And they agreed. So they cleared out a small space in the common area, pulled back the chairs and invited all the veterans in the building. And when the time came, the lights dimmed and the music started, soft, gentle, the same tune from the recital. A little girl in a blue dress took the stage, cheeks flushed, eyes searching the crowd until they found him. Harold sat up straighter. Evelyn took his hand. And their granddaughter spun around. But again and again, her legs were light, her arms outstretched, her smile so wide it seemed to chase away everything bad that had happened in the last 24 hours. When she finished, the hall exploded with applause, not polite, not rehearsed, but real. Veterans stood up. The nurses clapped. And Harold wiped his eyes, not because he was weak, but because he'd never felt more noticed, more respected, than in that single moment.